Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Geology 112, Dinosaurs in the Age of Reptiles. This is going to be the beginning of Unit 3. So we just finished Exam 2, which brought us to the end of the Jurassic period. And Unit 3 is going to cover the Cretaceous period in terms of dinosaurs, life, animals, plants, tectonics, geology, and also looking at the evolution of birds. So let's start out our first part with the age of tyrants. So let's look at the dinosaurs of the Cretaceous period. Now, the Cretaceous period spanned from approximately 145 to about 65, 66 million years ago. So it's the last period of the Mesozoic era before we enter into the Cenozoic era, which is the current era that we're living in. The Cretaceous period is broke down into two main epochs, the early and the late. So like, what about a middle? Well, the Albian and Cenomanian stages are stepping in essentially as our middle Cretaceous. And as we'll learn throughout this unit, the geologic record of the early and middle Cretaceous is a bit spotty. We have a very good record of the late, especially the Campanian and the Maastrichtian, but the other parts of the Cretaceous period are a little bit spotty here and there. So what I want to do is check in on some of these major dinosaur groups that we introduced in the Triassic and the Jurassic periods. So to start with, we'll look at our Saurischian sauropods and macronarians, the Titanosaurs. We no longer have any diplodocines like Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Brontosaurus, and so on in the Cretaceous period, but we have this new group of macronarians, so these would be distant cousins of Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus, the Titanosaurs. These are kind of the end of what we call our sauropod hiatus, which we'll get to in just a minute. They are a little bit shorter and have very, very stocky limbs, and they also have some armor on their skin. So the image that you see in the lower left is an osteoderm. These are bony plates or little bony armor coverings that are embedded in the skin. Crocodiles have these today. Their limbs are slightly bowed out, so they almost have like a stocky dog type appearance in their limbs, but these represent the largest group of sauropods and thus the largest land animals that ever lived. Alamosaurus is one of the better known and one of the larger of our titanosaurs. As you can see, there's quite a range in size of specimens. The largest Alamosaur is specimen BIBE 45854, which, as you can see, got to be around 70 to 80 tons and about 98 feet long. And this is a fairly well-known titanosaur, but it's certainly not the largest. The biggest titanosaur, and thus the largest dinosaur known to date, is Patagotitan. This is about 37 meters long, in other words, about 121 feet long, and weighed approximately 80 to 100 tons. So if you want to see what a Patagotitan looks like in person, you can go to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, Illinois, and when you walk in the front door, you'll meet Maximo. Max is an absolutely giant skeleton of a Patagotitan, and it's in the main hall at the Field Museum. It is incredibly large. Now, this sauropod hiatus. We see most of our diplodocines and Camarasaurs, Brachiosaurs, so on, go extinct at the end of the Jurassic, and the few sauropods we have in the early Cretaceous go extinct about 100 million years ago. And then we have about 25 million years where we don't find any sauropod fossils until about 75 million years ago, and towards the end of the late Cretaceous, sauropods reappear in the form of these massive South American titanosaurs. So, considering sauropods are big, they're kind of hard to hide. We don't really know what's going on with that sauropod hiatus. Perhaps it's a taphonomic issue. I mean, we just don't have them preserved. Or perhaps they're just like an isolated population and thus re-diversifying then later in the Cretaceous. So there's still work going on these really bizarre animals, and now throwing in a wrench into a very bizarre diversification event at the end of the Cretaceous. Last time when we talked about the Jurassic, we looked at a whole bunch of different theropods, our carnivorous dinosaurs, that diversified throughout the Jurassic period. And we looked at various groups of theropods, ceratosaurs, and then we looked at tetanurans like the megalosaurids and the avitheropods. Among them, we looked at carnosaurs and coelurosaurs, And of the Coelurosaurs, we looked at our very earliest Maniraptors and Tyrannosaurs. What we're going to do now is see what each of these groups is doing in the Cretaceous period. And I think you're going to be surprised at how much diversification has gone on from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous with our theropods. While last time in the Jurassic we looked at Ceratosaurus nuscornis, the Cretaceous ceratosaurs are much different. These are the abelisaurids, one of the strangest and, I'm biased here, but coolest theropod groups of the entire Mesozoic. These are mostly middle Cretaceous of South America and Africa, and they truly are bizarre. They have these massive shoulder blades and coracoids. They've got really blunt skulls and tiny little arms. If we thought T-Rex had tiny arms, look at this guy, Carnotaurus sastrii, one of our more popular abelisaurids. The black box that you see over onto the right, that's its humerus, and underneath that is its radius, ulna, wrist bones, and fingers, and that's actually a fairly complete specimen. It had ridiculously tiny arms. And this particular taxon, Carnotaurus, had huge horns extending out over its eyes. Now, other types of abelisaurids, such as Modongatholus and Abelisaurus itself, had really blunt faces with some other weird features, but nothing had the horns quite like Carnotaurus. Some of these may have also had those bony osteoderms similar to the Titanosaurs, thus obviously being convergent. Still, these are really, really strange animals that ceratosaurs took a very strange turn towards the middle Cretaceous. In the Jurassic, we looked at megalosaurs such as Torvosaurus and Megalosaurus bucklandi. And in the Cretaceous, a sub-branch of megalosaurs take on some other very strange characteristics, and these are the Spinosaurs. Spinosaurs were around from the early through the late Cretaceous of Europe and Africa, and they have these very diagnostic skulls that look very crocodile-like. They're long skulls, and their teeth are cone, rounded shaped, so they're not blade-like like an Allosaurus, for example. When you look at all of these characteristics among some others in their skeletons, we think that Spinosaurs hung around near water and predominantly ate fish, so they had a piscivorous diet for the most part. Many of them have very tall neural spines on their vertebrae, giving Spinosaurs their namesake, having these tall spines. And despite just Spinosaurus, which you may have seen in films like Jurassic Park 3, Spinosaurs actually are quite diverse. There's a number of different specimens, such as Baryonyx, which was featured in Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, Suchomimus, Irritator, and then, of course, Spinosaurus. Spinosaurus aegypticus is about 16 meters long, so it's about 52 feet. It makes it one of the larger of the Spinosaurs. Now, Baryonyx is among our shorter ones at around 30 feet long, or 8 meters, but still a very well-known specimen from England. Now, Spinosaurus itself has quite a history. The initial fossils of Spinosaurus were found in Cretaceous deposits in Egypt in the early 1900s. Around 1912 to 1915 is when it was described by paleontologist Ernst Stromer in Germany as Spinosaurus. Unfortunately, the museum in which those Spinosaurus specimens were housed were destroyed during the bombings in World War II. So all we've had for years for Spinosaurus are the archives that Stromer had kept and a bunch of diagrams and some photographs. However, we've found more Spinosaur specimens, especially over the last 10 years, and it has completely changed the way that we look at this animal. When Stromer first discovered and described Spinosaurus in the early 1900s, this is the reconstruction that we had. Notice it's very allosaur-like in the skull with these long neural spines, and it's doing what I call the Godzilla pose, where it's almost leaning back on its tail. However, with new discoveries of other Spinosaurids, such as Baryonyx and Suchomimus, this animal was revised in its description and its reconstruction to look like what you may have seen in the second Jurassic Park or third Jurassic Park movie, Spinosaurus, the way it was portrayed there. Still very basic theropod body plan, but with the tall spines and the crocodile-like face. However, with even further specimens of Spinosaurus, now we're starting to get into a very muddy type of situation. because we don't still have 100% idea what Spinosaurus looks like, but this is the current reconstruction. Now, this is based on a number of different specimens, which is why it's different colored, and we call that a chimera when it's just a mixture of different things. This could be what Spinosaurus aegypticus looked like, but we're not 100% sure because some of these specimens are from animals of different ontogenetic stages, so we're not really sure if we're scaling them properly. For example, the back legs look really funny, and wow, is that thing walking on 4 legs? It looks like it. So we go from the original Godzilla pose of Spinosaurus in the early 1900s to our current vision of Spinosaurus today, which looks like this. And more research is coming out really testing this hypothesis. Is this really what Spinosaurus looked like? We're not that sure yet. Now, Spinosaurs get a lot of attention for the obvious tall neural spines that give them their name, and also that long crocodile snout. And those are really bizarre features, but there's something else that Spinosaurids have that is also really impressive, and that's their hand claws. So this is a 3D print of the thumb claw of one of these smaller, still around 30 foot long, Spinosaurids baryonyx. In fact, the name baryonyx means heavy claw, and for obvious reasons. That is a massive, massive claw for something of its size. So Spinosaurs are also really known for things like this, which may have also helped in their predominantly fish-heavy diet. Moving our way through Theropoda in the Cretaceous, we can revisit what's going on with tetanourans, especially Avatheropods and Carnosaurians, the Carcharodontosaurids. Last time we looked at Carnosaurs, we focused on things like Allosaurus. So these are kind of the next step up for Allosaur Carnosaurian evolution. Carcharodontosaurids are from North and South America, predominantly South America, and we have them from the late Jurassic through the late Cretaceous. However, when things like Allosaurus go extinct in the end of the Jurassic period, the Carcharodontosaurids are the ones that start replacing them as the dominant dinosaurian predators until the late Cretaceous when big Tyrannosaurs come around. However, these things got pretty big too. In fact, some of them got longer than T-Rex, but maybe not as massive. Carcharodontosaurus and Giganotosaurus, respectively, both about 44 feet long. Their teeth are very thin and blade-like, which is where they get the name Carcharodontosaurids, which literally means shark-toothed lizards. And again, very, very big skulls, but lightly built. In fact, if we make a comparison between some of our Carcharodontosaurids, like Giganotosaurus or Carcharodontosaurus, with Allosaurs, we find that there are some similarities. So comparing the skeletons of these two, the arms are very similar. The rest of the skeletal structure is very, very similar, but the skulls have taken on some new modifications. But they're fairly easy to trace how those transformations took place. So we lose Allosaurs at the end of the Jurassic, but one of their close cousins diversifies to fill in that niche in the Cretaceous period. On the other side of the Avatheropod tree, we have Coelurosaurs. And we talked about Coelurosaurs a lot in the Jurassic. So just to review, these have been around since the Middle Jurassic to today, really. One group is still around today, and that would be the birds. But this includes a couple of other groups, including the Tyrannosaurids and our larger group, the Maniraptorans. So we characterize Coelurosaurs, again, by a longer sacrum than other dinosaurs. So they have very long hips from front to back. They also have a tail that stiffens towards the end, so the vertebrae interlock together very, very strongly towards the end of the tail, making it this kind of stiff-like rod that would help them turn very quickly when they were moving. Their lower arm, the ulna, is also bowed out a little bit more, which is a characteristic that becomes very important for birds. And they have a longer tibia than a femur. And if you look at modern-day birds, that's also the case. Like when you're eating a chicken leg, you're actually eating the meat off the lower leg. If you look at chicken thighs, they're much shorter. And that's a characteristic that goes all the way back to being a Coelurosaur. So I want to talk about two main groups of these Coelurosaurs, our Tyrannosaurids in the Cretaceous and our Maniraptorans in the Cretaceous. Now, this is not by any means an exhaustive list. These are just among some of the more popular ones. And the image I've put on there really shows the huge diversity and disparity among Coelurosaurs throughout the last 100 million years, because that little skeleton you see mounted is that of a hummingbird, and it is mounted right next to the crown of a Tyrannosaurus rex tooth. Both of these are coelurosaurs. One is a tyrannosaur, one is a modern Maniraptoran. So let's take a look at tyrannosaurids such as Albertosaurus, Gorgosaurus, Daspletosaurus, and of course Tyrannosaurus rex, and then we'll look at some of our Maniraptorans like the ornithomimids, the oviraptors, and the dromaeosaurids. Start out relatively small in the Jurassic. The Tyrannosaurids ultimately by the late Cretaceous become the largest terrestrial predators ever to walk the earth in terms of weight and size. These things are absolutely massive meat-eating monsters from the late Cretaceous. We find Tyrannosaurids predominantly in Asia and North America, and the ones that we'll be focusing on are the big late Cretaceous Tyrannosaurs. So after our Carcharodontosaurs, our carnosaurs from the Cretaceous, start to die out, these are what replace them. And not to waste any time, Tyrannosaurus rex. This is the biggest tyrannosaurid and also the heaviest, stockiest, most massive predatory dinosaur ever. It's about, on average, around 13 meters long, so about 42 feet. So it's a little bit shorter than things like Spinosaurus and Giganotosaurus, but it weighed approximately 6 to 10 tons. The amount of muscle mass and the stockiness of the bones here is really, really impressive. Tyrannosaurs have a very tiny forelimbs. I mean, we already talked about Abelisaurids having even smaller forelimbs, but these are still pretty small. However, we're finding out a couple of things that maybe they weren't always small. It really depends on the age. They also had an incredibly strong bite force for any terrestrial predator, and we'll get to more of that in just a minute. But we have a number of specimens of T-Rex, from Sioux to the famous AMNH, American Museum specimen 5027, the Stan specimen, BHI 3033, which I mentioned in the comments section, recently sold for a ridiculous amount of money. And then we have this little specimen called Jane, which I want to talk about a little bit more here. Now, we know a lot about T-Rex because everybody likes T-Rex, so we do a lot of research on T-Rex, despite not having the most specimens of every dinosaur. For example, we have more specimens of Triceratops, but we probably know a little bit more about T-Rex, and it's just because of its popularity. But one of the things we know about T-Rex is, or we're learning more, is how it grew up. So this is the tooth to a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, this is just the tooth crown, kind of like how when you were a kid and you lost one of your baby teeth, the root would have resorbed and you would have been left with the tooth crown that would have fallen out. So dinosaurs did this throughout their lives. They would shed their teeth and continuously grow new ones. So this is to maybe a 12-year-old T-Rex, and this is a full tooth with root of an adult T-Rex. So this, at 12 years old, became this by the time it was around 20. That's a massive amount of growth in a relatively short period of time. But there's actually more we're learning about tyrannosaur behavior from juvenile to adult that might surprise you. Now, to really get a good idea of what we can learn about how T-Rex grew up, we should look at two specimens, Sue and Jane. And by the way, these names are nicknames that are named either after benefactors or people that helped discover these particular specimens. And they're easier to say Sue and Jane than ramble off their museum catalog numbers. If you want to see Sue, you can go to the Field Museum in Chicago. If you go to see the Titanosaurus, stick around and see the T-Rex. This is the most complete T-Rex that's been found to date. It's about 42 feet long, and based on bone histology, where we can take the femur and cut it in half and count the growth rings of bone, Sue was about 28 to 30 years old when the specimen died. Jane is at the Burpee Museum in Rockford, Illinois, which is only about an hour and a half away from Chicago. It's the most complete juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex, was about 18 feet long, and was about 11 to 12, maybe 13 years old at the time of death. Based on the age of the Jane specimen, which is that BMRP 2002.4.1, see, it's easier just to say Jane. Jane weighed approximately 1,000 kilograms at the time of death and died right before a big, I don't want to say growth spurt, but for lack of a better phrase, period of time when there would have been considerable rapid growth. And we know this by looking at a number of Tyrannosaurus rex specimens from different ontogenetic stages. So what we're learning about with T-Rex is that they were born very small and grew very, very rapidly from around the ages of 13 until about 20. And that's when they were putting on these tremendous amounts, just pounds and pounds of muscle, and their entire skulls and skeletons were being remodeled. Jane is a fairly complete specimen of juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. If you look at this skeletal diagram, everything in white is what we actually have. So what you'll notice in one case where we don't have the left femur, but we have the right femur. We really only need half a dinosaur to get an idea what the other side looked like. But one of the most striking things about this specimen is actually its humerus, its upper arm bone. Because remember, we all say T-Rex has these tiny little arms. Well, now we have a small T-Rex, and actually its arms tell us quite a lot about how it grew up. When we compare the tiny forelimbs of Tyrannosaurs, we see that compared to other dinosaurs, yes, they had very, very small arms. Raptors like Deinonychus have these long grabbing arms. Even Allosaurus has big arms. It looks like it was doing curls. But T-Rex has these tiny little things. So what gives? Well, actually, if you look at the adult upper arm bone or humerus of a big adult T-Rex and compare it to a subadult or juvenile T-Rex like Jane, one is obviously smaller than the other, but it's not as small as you would have expected. So we don't really know what T-Rex was doing with its tiny little arms. Probably not much. It probably would just step on whatever it wanted to and then bite it like modern day ground birds do, like emus and other ratites. But it looks like subadult to juvenile Tyrannosaurs had proportionately longer arms than their adults. So the same way that if you have a puppy and its paws look really, really big, and then as it grows up, its paws don't shrink, but its paws don't grow as much compared to the rest of the body. We call that limb allometry. And that's what we think is happening with Tyrannosaurs, that they were born with arms that were a little more proportionate to their bodies. And then as they grew up, the arms didn't grow as much as the other parts of the body because they probably weren't using them as much when they were adults. So here are the two maxillae, the upper tooth-bearing bones of the Jane specimen. These are casts that I have from the Burpee Museum of Natural History, where the specimen is actually housed. Now, if you look at the right maxilla, it looks great. It's in really good shape. You can actually see even in the cast where there's a couple of replacement teeth that would have been coming in when the animal was still alive. However, when we look at the left maxilla, it's actually broken into two pieces, which is fine. We can fit it back together. And what you notice is we've got some extra holes up here that look like actually the bone surface was in the process of healing when this animal died. So these series of extra holes happened when this animal was still alive. Now, they're kind of oblong shaped. They're in a nice spaced pattern. And incidentally, they're spaced the same way of Jane's own maxillary teeth. So we interpreted these punctures as a bite on the face from another juvenile T-Rex. So what does this tell us about Tyrannosaurus rex? It tells us that by 13 years of age, they were capable and apparently willing to fight enough to actually puncture each other's faces. So this isn't like when your dogs are fighting and one bites the other one and it gets a little scratch. This is actually puncturing right into the face of another one. Now, what caused that fight, we have no idea. We don't know if they were siblings or they were fighting over mates or food or water or space or just bad moods. It tells us that T-Rex was capable of doing that at such a young age. But how much force is actually required to do that? Well, let's look a little bit at Tyrannosaurus bite force. There have been a number of studies done trying to estimate the bite force of something like T-Rex and other dinosaurs too. With living animals, we can just test it directly. There's a couple of different types of tools and equipment you can use to stick in an animal's mouth and see how much force they're using when they bite something. So, for example, humans bite on average of about 150 pounds of force, a hippopotamus around 1,800 pounds of force, a crocodile around 3,700 pounds of force. When paleontologists have gone into the lab and have replicated some of the bites that they think T-Rex could have made. We find that T-Rex had a bite force of about 8,000 pounds, which means it could pretty much crush and pulverize bone very, very easily. And this is supported by the fact that we have found T-Rex coprolite, yes, fossilized T-Rex poop, that has partially digested chunks of bone in it, which means they were biting, crushing, and swallowing, and then ultimately passing fragments of bones. So these are indiscriminate, what we call osteophagous feeders, osteophagous bone eating. T-Rex had blunt teeth when it became an adult that helped in absolutely destroying and pulverizing whatever it sunk its teeth into. Now, if we look at the other side of Coelurosauria and focus on the Maniraptors, there's quite a lot of diversity going on in the Cretaceous with these groups as well. We have the ornithomimids, the oviraptors, and the dromaeosaurids. The ornithomimids are sometimes called our ostrich mimic or ostrich-like theropods because really, if you take off the tail and put wings on there instead of arms, they look very, very similar to a modern-day emu or ostrich. Oviraptors are a very strange group of potentially omnivorous theropods that have very strange chicken-like faces. And then the dromaeosaurids are the ones that we would more commonly call the raptors. Ornithomimids, again, our ostrich-like theropods, include taxa such as Struthiomimus and Gallimimus, which, if you've seen the Jurassic Park films, these are the ones that run in the big flock. So they probably were very fast running, and these almost appear to be omnivorous too. They don't actually have teeth in their mouth, which is kind of odd for a theropod. So they were probably eating softer vegetation, insects, maybe small lizards. However, we do have some very large ornithomimids, such as Dinocarius. And Dinocarius is interesting because we've known about this animal for decades, but we actually didn't know it was an ornithomimid until just a few years ago, because all we had preserved was a set of arms. And these arms were absolutely massive and had huge claws. So if you look over time at reconstructions of Dinocarius, they've ranged from a large megalosaur-type theropod. And little did we know that not only is it a large ornithomimid, but it's also a humpbacked ornithomimid. So Dinocarius is one of our weirder theropod mysteries from the Cretaceous. The oviraptors, again, lots of skeletons of these from Mongolia and even some from the United States. Not many years ago, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago now, a new type of oviraptor was found in the late Cretaceous sediments of Montana in the Hell Creek Formation, not far from where a couple of Tyrannosaur sites were formed. So, and that particular taxa was called Anzu, and its nickname is the chicken from hell. So you can see the chicken-like face on these. They have almost this weird ornamented dinner plate structure on top of the skull, which was probably for display. Also, they don't really have teeth. Some of them have very small teeth, but most of them don't. And what's funny is when these were first discovered, they were found near a clutch of eggs. And so they got the name oviraptor because those researchers thought that this animal was trying to steal those eggs, until they found another set of the same kind of eggs and found tiny little baby skeletons of oviraptors inside of them. So in fact, they weren't trying to eat those eggs. They were trying to protect them. Yet they still have the name oviraptor, which means egg thief, has stuck. So it's really kind of an unfortunate situation for the oviraptors. However, we've learned a lot about theropod nesting behavior from oviraptors. So we have these nests, and notice that the eggs are actually arranged in a very specific pattern. This is something that some bird species do today, and apparently dinosaurs were doing it too. They didn't just lay eggs and sit on them, they were specifically arranged for brooding. In fact, we even have some specimens of oviraptors that have been preserved in a standing position. They were crouching over their eggs, trying to protect them from a sandstorm, and ultimately were buried alive with those eggs and perished. So it's a rather sad story, but we've learned a lot about oviraptor and just theropod nesting behaviors in general from these animals. And it's not just oviraptors, but also some of our plant-eating dinosaurs like the hadrosaurs that we'll talk about here in a moment that also were very good parents and took care of their young and took care of the eggs that were sitting in the nest. So here's another egg clutch from a group of theropods. And if you look carefully, you can see there's a tiny embryo skeleton inside of that egg, which allows us to then reconstruct what a little baby oviraptor would have looked like. Our favorite Maniraptorans, the Dromaeosaurids, or as you might know them as the raptors. Raptors are known from the Cretaceous period of Asia and North America. These are relatively smaller types of theropods, though we do have some fairly large ones, even in North America. The raptors, as they're called, have very stiffened tails, so they're a classic example of a coelurosaur. But their tails become very stiff towards the end into almost this rigid rudder for running. Very large sickle claws on the feet, though depending on the size of the animal, some are larger than others. And they do appear to be a fairly agile ambush predator. Some of them, in fact, Utah raptor is a little bit stockier than some of the other ones like Deinonychus and Velociraptor, but still would have been quite fast on its feet. There's some evidence that these animals may have hunted in groups, or at least spent some time in groups, but that's starting to be questioned by some new research looking at chemical compositions of teeth and finding that maybe they weren't traveling in large packs like we once thought. In the illustration you see of the two raptors jumping on the back of the poor Tyrannosaurus up there, this has been a long view of Dromaeosaurids for many years, that they were these pack hunters that would jump on the back of larger dinosaurs with these big claws and then bring them down, almost like just a big gang of them taking these things down. However, that's being questioned as well, because if you actually look at the claws of the big sickle killing claw on a Dromaeosaurid, they're very thin, actually. Now, if I were a big plant-eating dinosaur like that Tyrannosaur, and these two pesky raptors jumped on my back and dug their sharp claws into me, I wouldn't be too happy about that. I'd probably do everything I can and use my body weight to shake them off, and it'd probably kill them. So we don't really think that Dromaeosaurids were taking down giant prey. Now, that being said, we have a lot of Tyrannosaur specimens that have been chewed on by raptors. We find their teeth, we find the bite marks. But that doesn't mean the raptors killed them. It could just mean that it was a free meal. Because if you actually look at what modern day predatory birds like owls and hawks and eagles, modern day raptors, do today, they do also have a kind of prehensile sickle-like claw on their foot. But they don't use it to take down big things like bison. Instead, they use those claws to stand on prey that's their own size or smaller and use it to perch on top while they're eating. So while it's not as exciting necessarily as what we see in the movies, this is possibly a more likely scenario of what a Dromaeosaurid would have been doing with that big sickle claw, is perching on top of something like a Cretaceous possum. Okay. But let's look a little bit more at everybody's favorite Dromaeosaurid, the Velociraptor. Now, prior to the Jurassic Park films, nobody knew what a velociraptor was. In fact, Dromaeosaurids were known by paleontologists, but they weren't a favorite among non-paleontologists, even among dinosaur enthusiasts. That movie, and those movies, plural I should say, actually brought a lot of attention about Dromaeosaurids to the public eye and made Velociraptor a household name. I would say, though, that what we think of as Velociraptor, based on the Jurassic Park films, is not really Velociraptor. Because while in the movies they stand about 6 or 7 feet tall and about 12 feet long, in real life, Velociraptor mongoliensis was much smaller. That big giant killing claw on their foot, I mean, it's big, but it's not that big. And as far as that big skull, here we go. That's Velociraptor right there. It's kind of a cute little guy. I mean, I wouldn't want to make it mad, but it does have a lot of little sharp teeth, but it wasn't nearly as big as what we see in the movies. In fact, Velociraptor only stood about maybe 2.5 feet tall and maybe 6 feet long from the tip of the tail to the tip of the nose. So to put that size into perspective, here's Velociraptor right there. It's not exactly the big giant predator that we thought we saw in the Jurassic Park films. In fact, that looks something more like this, which is Utah Raptor. And in fact, Utahraptor was found literally just a few months after the first Jurassic Park film was released back in the 90s. However, we're learning that Utahraptor was a lot bigger and stockier. Now, one thing you might notice about all these dromaeosaurids, first of all, they vary in size considerably. And we're illustrating them with feathers, which might seem a little strange if you've seen any of the Jurassic Park films. But this is actually based on some really hard evidence that dromaeosaurids and other theropods had feathers. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because we are going to do a whole lecture on the evolution of birds from things like these more basal manoraptors. But I do want to point out that we do have strong evidence, such as attachment sites on the arms and even feather impressions for many of these dromaeosaurids. So whether they were small ones like Microraptor or weird ones here like Australoraptor or the giant Utahraptor or even the common Deinonychus, they were probably all feathered to some degree or another. Now, when I tell people that raptors like you see in Jurassic World were probably feathered, a lot of people scoff and think, oh, that doesn't look very scary. Just imagine those big fluffy feathered, animals. I just don't visualize them that way. Well, got to remember that with science, we can't stick to an idea just because we like it. We have to go where the evidence leads. But I would like to add from a personal perspective, I don't know what they're talking about where they say that a feathered velociraptor or any kind of dromaeosaurid wouldn't look scary. Because this is how we see them in the movie. This is how they would have looked feathered. That doesn't look any less scary. In fact, to me, that looks even more terrifying. Now, so far, we've been focusing on our Cretaceous Saurischians. But what about the Ornithischians? Because we had quite a lot of diversity going on with them in the Jurassic. Well, this diversification goes overdrive in the Cretaceous. We have new groups of our Thyreophorans. Remember, last time we looked at things like stegosaurs for Ornithischians. We have new types of ornithopods, so beyond things like Camptosaurus. And we also have a whole new group of Thyreophorans, the Ankylosaurs, plus a new clade of Ornithischians, the Marginocephalians, which include the dome-headed Pachycephalosaurs and the horned Ceratopsians. So to revisit Thyreophorans, remember, these are our armored dinosaurs. So the stegosaurs had the plates and the spikes on their backs. Ankylosaurs are essentially walking tanks. They're very heavily armored. They have huge, thick osteoderms or bony skin armor fused all over their back into something that almost looks like an armadillo shield. Even on their eyes, they had armor over their eyes. And many of them also have a big club at the end of their tails. So we have two groups of ankylosaurs. We have the nodosaurs, which are more primitive, and we're starting to see more of these in the late Jurassic going into the Cretaceous. And then the ankylosaurs with the big heavy clubs, like Ankylosaurus, are present in the Cretaceous. So we have Thyreophora, which could be stegosaurs or ankylosaurs. And of the ankylosaurs, we have two groups, the ankylosaurids and the nodosaurids. So these are a couple of our ankylosaurids. We have Gastonia and Edmontonia. Now notice lots of tiny little osteoderms and plates all over the body, and also some big spikes coming off of the shoulders. So these were really heavily armored dinosaurs, and you can see why they're sometimes nicknamed the walking tanks. Now there's one specimen of this taxa known as Borealopelta, which is an absolutely breathtaking fossil. This was found a couple years ago by a crew working for a petroleum industry up in Canada. And luckily, they contacted paleontologists when they dug this thing up, and they helped get it removed rather than just blasting through it. Now, the entire specimen isn't there, but we have the entire front half of it. Not only do we have it preserved, but it's preserved in 3 dimensions. This dinosaur looks like it just laid down and went to sleep. Not only that, but there's even preserved skin and, most recently, some preserved skin injuries present on this specimen. Now, our ankylosaurids had these big club tails at the end and heavily ossified or mineralized tails. So instead of the tail vertebrae being flexible, they fused together into these long rods with these big clubs at the end. When we look at these clubs, there's some good evidence that they were sustaining damage through life. So ankylosaur clubs are highly vascular. There's a lot of blood vessels going there to keep that club protected. So they were probably using these to possibly fight with each other. They probably didn't use them too much for defense, though that would have been a useful tool. We look at our new group of ornithischians. This is in a new clade called Sauropoda, which includes our hadrosaurs, but the marginocephalians, or what that name means is fringe heads. And that's because both of these groups of plant-eating ornithischians have some kind of modification to the frontoparietal regions on their skulls, or the parietosquamosal shelves. This is like right off the back of the skull. In the pachycephalosaurs, it's a dome, and in the ceratopsians, it's that big flat shield. And these are our two main groups, the ceratopsians and the pachycephalosaurs. So let's start by looking at what's going on with the evolution of our horned dinosaurs, the ceratopsians. This little guy is Psittacosaurus. The name means parrot-faced lizard for obvious reasons. It's got that little beak on it, and just a generally kind of curved nose that makes it look a lot like a parrot. Now, Psittacosaurus is a very common dinosaur in China, and actually it's one of the earliest, not the earliest, but one of the earliest abundant ceratopsians. But this was just the beginning, because from Psittacosaurus, we saw ceratopsians diversify to some incredible lengths and incredible shapes throughout the Cretaceous period. Basal ceratopsians are generally pretty small, only about 1 to 2 meters in length. If you had to choose a dinosaur as a pet, these would make pretty good candidates. They're very common in China and Mongolia, and it may be there where some of our earliest ceratopsians are starting to evolve. As I mentioned before, psittacosaurs are incredibly common, but so are our other early ceratopsian, Protoceratops. So the next stop on our ceratopsian tour is this guy, Protoceratops. Notice we don't have horns yet, but we still have the pronounced beak, and we're starting to see that frill in the back really start to change shape and broaden out a lot more. Now, these are also very, very common Cretaceous dinosaurs, especially in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. So you find lots and lots of Protoceratops, and actually, there have been some Protoceratops that have been found in very close proximity, one locked in combat with our favorite Velociraptor. And this guy here is Zuniceratops. Now, it's not Triceratops. In fact, it's way too small and way too early. But what makes Zuniceratops so unique is that this is among the first of what we call the Neoceratopsians. So it's from Zuniceratops that we quickly saw arise to the larger Cretaceous ceratopsians like Triceratops, Styracosaurus, Centrosaurus, and so on. A couple of features to point out. Again, we see that parietosquamosal frill, the frontal parietosquamosal frill, really expanding out more, and we finally start seeing brow horns. We don't have a nose horn yet, but we have brow horns on Zuniceratops. So it is from this that we start seeing what we think of when we hear ceratopsian, like Triceratops. So this is a cousin, an early cousin of Triceratops, and kind of the next progression from things like Psittacosaurus to Protoceratops to the Neoceratopsians. And it's in with the Neoceratopsians that this group really diversifies throughout the middle to late Cretaceous. They become much larger, so much heavier bodies. Triceratops pushing 20, 30 feet long. Very, very highly diverse cranial structures. So we think of the classic Triceratops with the big solid shield and the 2 horns over the eyes and the 1 over the nose. But Chasmosaurus, Centrosaurus, and on and on and on. You can see in the image I have here, that's a museum exhibit on a wall in the Natural History Museum of Utah in Salt Lake City, where they show you the cladogram of some, not even all, but some of the different types of ceratopsians that have mostly been found in Utah. There's Diabloceratops, there's Cosmoceratops, there's all of these different kinds. Their horns are going in all sorts of different directions. The frills are widening and expanding, doing all sorts of things. They were filling all sorts of different niches in the Cretaceous period. Today, if you think about four-legged, plant-eating, horned, herd-dwelling, plant-eating animals, you're going to think of bovids like cows and bison and deer. Back in the Cretaceous, if you were talking about all those characteristics, you'd be looking at ceratopsians. So here's another view of some of the cranial diversity we get with our Neoceratopsians, from the kind of curved inward top horns and spikes of Bagaceratops down to the solid shield that we see on Triceratops. And there's two I want to point out here, Torosaurus and Triceratops. So this includes this guy and these two. Okay. Now the rest of these are found in different stratigraphic units. However, Torosaurs and Triceratops are actually found in the same uppermost Cretaceous units. And that has led some paleontologists to hypothesize that these two are actually the same thing, that Torosaurus is an old grown-up version of Triceratops. So in other words, everything we've called Triceratops could potentially be a not fully grown individual, and Torosaurus is an example of an old Triceratops. So how do they come up with a hypothesis like that? A lot of it comes down to looking at the bone histology. So in other words, when you cut the bone in half and you look at the texture and look at the growth rings in some of these skeletons and skulls. And what we find is that while Torosaurus has these big openings inside of its frill and Triceratops does not, there are some specimens of Triceratops where we see that frill starting to thin. Now, does that absolutely mean that this is growing from one kind to another? Not necessarily. But it is being hypothesized, so it's a valid concept to bring up. And if you take smallest specimens of Triceratops and line them up together, as we get to larger ones, you can see that there is a lot of ontogenetic change going on from figure A, which is a juvenile Triceratops right here, that's a little baby, all the way up to this potential adult. Now, could figure E get even bigger and longer and they start developing holes in the skull? That's a possibility that's being studied. So it's in our Cretaceous dinosaurs, whether it's T-Rex to Triceratops or the next group that we're going to look at, that ontogeny might be playing a huge role. Our other group of marginocephalians are one of my favorite, the Pachycephalosaurs. These are a group of Cretaceous bipedal, mostly plant-eating as far as we know, though maybe omnivorous, ornithischians or marginocephalians. They've got weird head modifications. They've got a very thickened dome on top of their skull that's made of the parietals and frontal bones. So the front of your skull and the back of your skull fused together. Now, that's not full of air inside of that. That's solid bone. In fact, these things can be up to a foot thick and usually surrounded by a ring of horns. So what did they use these things for? That's something that's been baffling paleontologists ever since these were first discovered. Now, we also have a number of different types of Pachycephalosaurs from the Cretaceous, and we notice that not all of them have the same kind of domed skull. In fact, there's a couple that are found in the same stratigraphic units as Triceratops, Torosaurus, and T-Rex that also show this kind of ontogenetic growth. So this is the Pachycephalosaurid Dracorex hogwartsia. Yes, this dinosaur is named Dracorex hogwartsia, which literally translates to the King Dragon of Hogwarts. It's named after Harry Potter. Moving on, notice that it doesn't actually have a dome, but it has a flat skull and lots of spikes. We also have another Pachycephalosaurid that's found in the same unit, known as Stygimoloch, and it has a small dome and big horns. And then we have the proper Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis, which has a huge dome and very, very small horns. So the idea that's been proposed is that the dome grew as the animal grew and the spikes became reduced. It's very plausible. It's definitely plausible. It could also be dimorphism. One could be female, one could be male. We're not really sure yet. But this is some of the research that's still being tested, and we're still looking for more fossils of these animals to figure out how they grew up, just like we've been doing with T-Rex and Triceratops. Now, when we look at these skulls, whether it's Dracorex or Pachycephalosaurus or Homalocephaly or Stegosaurus, we notice a wide variety of skull shapes and spike shapes, but it really begs the question, what is that dome actually used for? Well, it's solid bone with a very small brain case underneath, and there's been some interesting research done on its ability to absorb energy, like from impacts, for example. Because in the 1970s, there was a science fiction story that came out proposing that these animals butted heads with these dome skulls. And there was no evidence for that other than, well, they've got a big battering ram type thing on their skulls, so why not? Maybe they acted like bighorn sheep. But this dome function has been debated. Some actually say that the dome didn't have a physical function beyond species recognition or sexual display, essentially a way of these animals saying, hey, look how attractive I am and how physically fit I am, maybe similar to how deer use their antlers today. However, deer also use their antlers today to fight with other deer over resources, mates, for competition. The question is, what would you expect if these animals were butting heads? Well, you'd probably expect a lot of injuries from this so-called combat. So here's one type of pachycephalosaurid known as Stegosaurus, not to be confused with Stegosaurus, Stegosaurus. This is one of our smaller pachycephalosaurids, but again, you can see it's got this big, thick frontal parietal dome on top of its skull. And no, that's not where the brain was housed. The brain was housed in that tiny little cavity right there. So when we were talking about how do we know if these things actually butted heads, well, we have some specimens that show some really intriguing features. This is a dome cast of a pachycephalosaurus, and you can notice on top we have these big lesions, these big erosive lesions. So this isn't like a caved-in skull from an impact, but something happened to this skull when the animal was alive that caused this huge infection on top of the skull. And it turns out there's a lot of Pachycephalosaurus specimens that have stuff just like this. So how do we actually test the behavior of an extinct animal? I figured this would be a good time to talk a little bit about how we approach behavior with the fossil record. You'll read a lot of things and see a lot of things on documentaries where they talk about what dinosaurs or other extinct organisms could or couldn't do, or what they did or didn't do. And a lot of times it's speculation, but sometimes we actually do have some evidence for a particular kind of behavior. So there's a certain approach that we use. And the first step, if you're interpreting behavior in an ancient organism, is to make sure that behavior actually exists in animals living today. So in the case of pachycephalosaurs using their heads for competition, does that exist today? Are there animals today that use their ornamented headgear for competitive purposes? Absolutely. There's a wide variety, but it's predominantly in bovids, in mammals, in ungulates. So bighorn sheep will run at each other at a distance and crash heads. Impala will fight with their horns almost like they're fencing. Those two Cape buffalo look like they're leaning in for the photo, but they're actually hitting their horn bosses with each other. And bison will just beat the crap out of each other however they can. So there is a wide variety of ways that animals today, especially bovids, will fight with their ornamented headgear. We also notice that this fighting leaves injuries. So this is from a paper I published with a student a couple years ago, where we looked at bighorn sheep and Dall sheep and known head-butting and head-striking mammals and found, yeah, they have erosive lesions on the top of their skulls, not from them being caved in, but because of damage that's inflicted during these combative bouts. And they don't, they didn't exactly go to the doctor afterwards, so they would sometimes become infected, and you would get this erosive lesion in the bone. So the next question then is, does this exist in the fossil record? So what we did for this particular study is we looked at 109 pachycephalosaurid domes, and we found that 23% of them show these types of injuries or pathologies. Now, this wasn't just in one type of pachycephalosaurid. It was in 15 different species, and it spanned over 10 million years. So over 10 million years, 15 different types of pachycephalosaurids, and we found that about 23% showed these kinds of injuries. So these are some of the injured pachycephalosaurid domes we looked at, and the arrows are pointing to areas where we have erosive lesions on the surface of the domes. And they're right at the top or close to the top on these domes, suggesting that whatever's going on with these animals, they're getting frequent infections and damage to the top of their skulls. But the question then was, is that damage being dealt with when they're alive? Is their body trying to heal from these injuries, or is this something that's happening maybe after the animal died? To figure that out, we actually CT scanned a bunch of domes. So actually in death, these things are getting better health care than when they were alive. In figures A and D of the CT scanned Pachycephalosaur dome, you'll see where the arrows are pointing to this little dark area. It's called a rarefied zone. And what that's from is it's an area where the bone was actively being remodeled. So in other words, this injury, the injuries that we're highlighting on this particular skull, were in the process of healing when the animal died. So this did happen when the animal was still alive, and its body was fighting off that infection, or at least trying to, but there was already erosion that had taken place from bacteria on the top of this dome. We also plotted every single injury that we found. So we're using that Stegosaurus skull cap again as just a model in this case. And all of those dots are showing you on every Pachycephalosaur that we looked at, where did we find injuries. And the black and the white difference is actually dependent on what kind of Pachycephalosaur. Was it one that has a partially domed skull, or is it a big, fully domed skull? So some have different dome shapes than others. And what we found is that our fully domed ones are much more clustered towards the center. You notice the black dots are more towards the center, and the white dots are spread out a little bit more. What we interpreted from that is, for the black dot ones, the fully domed ones, they're getting injuries right at the top of their skulls, and the partially domed ones are getting them more towards the back of the skull. So perhaps our different types of domes are getting injured in different ways. Figure A and B, that's what we would call a partially domed Pachycephalosaur, because they have a bit of a shelf on the back of the head. And where would we commonly see the injuries? Well, if they're hitting with the back of their skulls. And our figure C and D is a fully domed Pachycephalosaurid. It's one called Pranocephaly, and we see that more head to head. So I don't think these animals were running at each other from 100 yards and cracking heads. That would probably kill them. However, it does appear that they have injuries that are consistent with a behavior where they might be shoving each other or fighting a little bit. So we'll wrap up our ornithischians by looking at ornithopods. In the Jurassic, we were focusing on things like Camptosaurus as some of our earliest ornithopods. In the Cretaceous, we have quite a lot of diversification. This is just like ceratopsians. They just go in all sorts of different directions in the Cretaceous. Now, ornithopod means bird foot for some reason, since theropods to me look more like bird feet than ornithopods, but whatever. These, once again, are facultative quadrupeds, meaning that they could walk on 2 or 4 limbs. Very complex teeth and jaws with lots and lots of shearing teeth for vegetation. And they really hit their diversity in the Cretaceous with 2 main groups, the iguanodontians and the hadrosaurs. Iguanodontians are from the early to middle Cretaceous in North America and Europe. One of the first types of dinosaurs. In fact, at the beginning of the semester, we did talk about Gideon Mantell and the naming of Iguanodon. These things had the big thumb spike, and a long time ago they thought it was on the nose. But we now know that it was on the thumb. These got to be about 20 to 30 feet long, and we have quite a few of them actually, especially from Europe. So iguanodons are a pretty well-known taxa. And you can actually look at the evolution from Camptosaurus in the Jurassic to iguanodons in the Cretaceous fairly easily. The skeletons are pretty similar, the skulls are pretty similar, with only some moderate modifications along the way. Now, our hadrosaurids, though, were much more diverse and a lot more specialized. These are predominantly late Cretaceous in Europe, North America, and Asia. These got much larger, so 30 to 40 feet long. We have lots of good nesting behavior and herd behavior, so we do think these were a gregarious group. They traveled in groups. In fact, a lot of them have injuries on their tails, which has been hypothesized to being from stepping on each other, living in close proximity. And some of them, a particular group called the Lambeosaurines, had these highly ornamented crests potentially for sound production and display. So since we're talking about hadrosaurs, this is a cast of the hadrosaur Saurolophus, which means crested lizard or crested reptile. And that is due to the horn-like structure that's sticking up out of the skull. Now, that's not actually a horn, though. That was a hollow tube or series of tubes that was coming off the back of the skull that's actually connected to their nose and their throat, so they could breathe through that. This animal was from Asia, got around 32 to 35 feet long, but it has a cousin known as Parasaurolophus, which took this crest to a whole new extreme. Here you can see Parasaurolophus on the right with that long crest. So you've got Saurolophus, which has the smaller crest, and Parasaurolophus, which is a type of Lambeosaurine. The hadrosaurines are the more simple forms of hadrosaurs, and the Lambeosaurines have these elaborate crests, whether it's Hipparchosaurus, Parasaurolophus, or Lambeosaurus properly. These probably weren't used for combat like maybe with ceratopsians or pachycephalosaurs. These were much more delicate and do appear to actually have been for display and sound production even. Now there's actually been some digital computer modeling of Parasaurolophus skulls, and we've learned some really amazing things out of this. That skull tube is actually about 6 feet long. It's really, really big. But if you CT scan it and model it in 3 dimensions, what we found is that it's actually 12 feet long and folded in half. So this would transport air from the nostrils all the way back, curve around, come back down like a trombone into the body and into the lungs, and vice versa. So today, when we see animals with this elaborate kind of structure, it's usually used for something like sound production. And by computer modeling what that structure would have looked like and how it would have functioned, we've actually been able to digitally put air through this thing and figure out what Parasaurolophus may have sounded like. So if you want to hear what the Cretaceous may have sounded like with Parasaurolophus, turn up your speakers. And as chilling as that sound can be, some of the other animals that were alive during the Cretaceous period are also a bit strange as well. So next week, we're going to be covering Cretaceous ecosystems, stratigraphy, and ultimately leading up to the Cretaceous extinction. And we'll be looking at some of the other forms of life, like the giant pterosaurs that sailed through the skies during the Cretaceous period.